I have told this story before, and I will tell it again, because it is the only story of my brother's life that contains any warmth at all. My name is Edmund Harrow. I am the younger son of the late Duke of Veldermere, which means I was the one who grew up in my brother Caspian's considerable shadow, and when our father died, moved to the dower house on the east corner of the estate with a modest allowance and a great deal of relief. I watched Caspian take on the dukedom at 22 and become, within 5 years, the man the northern counties called the Cold Duke, which is to say the man they respected, feared, petitioned for favors, and avoided at dinner parties. He was not cruel. He was simply enclosed, a house with all its shutters bolted. You could see the light around the edges, and you told yourself you imagined it. I want to say now, before I begin, that what happened in that first year of his marriage to Emmeline Farrow was not a love story I observed from a distance. I was there for the worst of it and most of the best. I had dinner at Veldermere Hall twice a week, and supper sometimes 3 times because, frankly, Caspian employed a better cook than I did, and because I loved my brother, however bolted his shutters were. I watched the whole thing unfold the way you watch a very tightly closed bud in your garden, not certain, not patient, but unable to look away. Emmeline's father, Lord Prentice Farrow, was a man I had met twice at county assemblies and found, each time, pleasantly sociable and alarmingly vague about money. He had the confidence of a man who believed his estate ran itself, which it did, chiefly because his eldest daughter had been running it since she was 17. Lord Farrow played cards the way other men breathed, continuously without thinking about it and with the same inability to stop. By the spring of Emmeline's 23rd year, the estate accounts were so thoroughly ruined that he owed debts to 3 separate creditors, the largest of which was a consortium my brother's solicitors had, for various complicated reasons of their own, recently acquired. I should say that Caspian did not scheme this. He did not manipulate the situation to trap a woman. He barely knew Emmeline existed. What happened was that his solicitors came to him with a proposal. The Farrow debt was significant. The Farrow land was adjacent to the Veldermere North pasture that Caspian had been trying to consolidate for 2 years, and the family covenant my grandfather had written. The one that stipulated the dukedom's lands could not be formally expanded without a residing duchess to co-sign, had in Caspian's 7 years as duke become something of a grinding inconvenience. He needed a wife. He had not acquired one, because acquiring a wife meant opening one's house to another person's presence, and the thought apparently made him feel the way most men feel about a tooth extraction. Necessary, postponable, dreaded. His solicitors were pragmatic men. They pointed out that there was a young woman of good family, reasonable reputation, and no meaningful alternative, who might be persuaded to accept a formal marriage covenant in exchange for her father's debts being cleared, and a settlement secured for her younger siblings. They put it before him in the language of ledgers, which was the only language Caspian had trusted since our mother died. He agreed. He did not meet Emmeline before the papers were signed. I think, in retrospect, that was the cruelest part, not cruel by intention, only by the particular coldness of a man who had learned to treat every human transaction as a transaction. Emmeline's father presented the situation to her one morning in March, sitting in the study of a house that was quietly falling apart around him. The fire in the grate was burning low. It was always burning low now, because coal cost money and money was exactly what they did not have, and Lord Farrow sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his eyes not quite meeting hers, and told her there was a solution. He told her it involved a marriage. He told her the Duke of Veldermere was reputable, titled, and would not trouble her unduly. Emmeline looked at her father for a long time. She looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years doing nothing more useful than shuffling cards. She looked past him, out the window, at the kitchen garden she had planted herself 3 years before, the rows of winter vegetables, the espalier apple tree she had trained along the south wall, the cold frames she had built with salvaged timber. Someone else would tend it now. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether the settlement for her younger siblings was firm and not subject to revision. He told her it was. She asked whether the Farrow estate would be retained for her brother when he came of age. He told her it would, the debts cleared and the property intact. She picked up the pen from his desk. She signed the papers herself, clearly and without ceremony. She set the pen down and said, "I'll need a week to arrange the household before I go." Then she stood up and went back to the kitchen to finish the bread she had been making when he called her in. I heard this version from Emmeline herself, much later over a pot of strong tea. She told it in the same tone she told everything, direct, without sentiment about the past and without self-pity, only the particular clarity of a woman who had looked at a situation and decided how to move through it. She said the signing had not been difficult. She said the week before she left had been harder, packing up the account books and making sure her younger sister, Clara, understood the household records well enough to manage, writing out a full inventory of everything she was leaving behind, going through the estate with the farm manager one last time to check that the spring planting was properly arranged. She said she had left the kitchen garden as well ordered as she could. "And your father?" I asked. She said he saw me off at the door and wept a little. A pause. I was not sure what he was weeping for. I did not ask. She arrived at Veldermere on a Friday in early April. I was there, which I admit was largely out of curiosity. The carriage that came up the Veldermere drive was not the Faro carriage, that, I learned later, had been sold the previous autumn. It was a hired vehicle, and Emmeline descended from it alone, without a maid, carrying a single trunk and a small leather case of what turned out to be estate ledgers she had brought with her on the grounds that she had nothing else to read. She had been on the road for the better part of 2 days, stopping twice at coaching inns, and she had spent most of her journey looking out the carriage window at the changing landscape and thinking about drainage. She was not what I expected. I had assembled in my mind, based on nothing in particular, a vague image of a pale and trembling creature pressed into this situation against her will, visibly afraid. Emmeline Faro was not afraid. She was composed, in the way that certain people are composed because they have been holding themselves very straight for a very long time, and it has become simply how they stand. She was a young woman of medium height, with dark hair pinned neatly back and gray eyes that took in Veldermere Hall's stone facade with the same expression a surveyor might use, not awed, not cowed, only calculating distance and taking in detail. Caspian met her in the entrance hall. I stood slightly to one side, technically there to welcome her and practically there to observe. He bowed correctly. She curtsied correctly. He said, "Miss Faro, welcome to Veldermere." He did not say, "I hope you will be comfortable here." He did not say, "I am glad you have come." He said, "Welcome," and it sounded precisely like the word on a formal letter. Emmeline looked at him steadily and said, "Thank you, Your Grace. Where shall I find the household accounts?" A silence. Caspian blinked, which was the closest thing to visible surprise I had ever seen from him. "I beg your pardon." "The household accounts," she said. "I understood I am to function as the Duchess of Veldermere. I should like to begin." I believe I smiled. Caspian, to his credit, did not look annoyed. He looked at her for a moment with the careful look he gave things that did not behave as expected, and then he said, "I will have Morley show you to your rooms. The accounts can be discussed tomorrow." He paused. "You have not yet had dinner." "I ate on the road," she said, which was what she told him, though I learned later it was not precisely true. She had spent most of her traveling money on her siblings' next quarter's provisions, and what she had eaten on the road was a bread roll and some cold tea purchased at a coaching in 3 hours north of the county boundary. She did not say any of this. She simply accepted the rooms, declined the late supper Caspian's housekeeper pressed on her, and disappeared up the east wing staircase with her trunk and her ledgers. Caspian watched her go. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment after she had turned the corner, not something my brother did as a rule, stand still in hallways thinking, and then he said, "She brought ledgers." "She did," I said. He turned back toward his study. "Good," he said, which was not the response I had anticipated, and went inside and closed the door. I walked home in the dark wondering what exactly was going to happen here, and whether my brother had any idea. The morning after her arrival, Emmeline met with Caspian in his study for precisely 45 minutes, during which they discussed the terms of their arrangement. Caspian presented her with a written summary, 1 page, formalized, which set out what was expected. She was to serve as Duchess in all social and civic functions the estate required. She was to maintain the household. She was to be treated with courtesy by all staff. The arrangement was, in the language Caspian had written, a covenant of mutual benefit and practical necessity to be reviewed at the 6-month mark. The dower house in the south corner of the estate would serve as her private retreat should she require it. Her father's debts had been cleared. Her siblings' settlement was in trust. She read it, all of it, carefully, which he had not expected, standing at his desk with the page in both hands and her eyes moving steadily through every line. She asked one question: what was the 6-month review? He told her it was a provision in the covenant allowing either party to petition for dissolution at that point, with all agreed settlements remaining intact regardless of outcome. She asked whether he anticipated dissolution at 6 months. He said he did not intend to anticipate anything. She nodded once, took the paper, and said, "I will want to go over the household accounts with your housekeeper this afternoon, and I will need to know which rooms in the east wing are in current use, as I noticed several doors that appeared unused and possibly damp." She stood. "Thank you, Your Grace." He stood when she did, out of habit. She curtsied and left. He sat back down and looked, I am told, at the door for a long moment, and then at the space where the paper had been. She had, in one motion, folded it and placed it in her pocket rather than laying it back on his desk or returning it to his hands. He had never before had a person take his formal agreement and simply pocket it as though it were a receipt. He picked up his pen and returned to his work. Within a week, Emmeline had reviewed every household account Veldermeer possessed. Within 2 weeks she had, quietly and without drama, reorganized the linen inventory, identified that 2 footmen were being paid for overlapping duties that could be consolidated, and had Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, who had been at Veldermeer for 30 years and resisted change with the fixed determination of a stone wall, eating out of her hand on the grounds that Emmeline had asked her opinion on every decision before making it. She did not sweep in with authority. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. Then she solved problems so quietly that people realized things had been fixed only after they were. I came to dinner twice that first week, as was my habit, and I watched Caspian watch her. He was not obvious about it. He was never obvious about anything. But I had known my brother my whole life, and I knew the particular quality of his attention when something had deviated from his expectations, and he was reassessing. He reassessed Emmeline across the dinner table the way he read difficult contracts, with close and private attention and no expression at all. She talked at dinner, which surprised him. She was not a woman who talked to fill silence. She talked because she had things to say, and what she said was generally worth saying. She told me about the state of the north pasture fencing she had observed from her window and said, correctly, that it would need to be replaced before winter. She asked Caspian, without particular deference, whether the tenant cottages on the East Road had been inspected recently, as she had noticed from the drive that 2 of them had missing roof tiles. Caspian said they had been inspected in October. She said the rain in November had been heavy and October's inspection might bear revisiting. He looked at her across the table. She met his gaze, not defiant, only steady. The following morning he sent a man to inspect the tenant cottages. 3 had missing or damaged roof tiles. He had them repaired. He did not tell her he had done it. She noticed the work underway from her window and did not mention it at dinner, but I saw her, very briefly, not quite smile at her bread roll. These were not dramatic victories. They were small, accumulating, quiet ones, the kind that leave no single visible mark, but alter, over time, the entire shape of a landscape. The garden was a different matter. Veldermeer Hall had, on its south side, a walled garden of perhaps half an acre that had been designed and planted by my mother when she came to the estate as a young bride. She had loved it fiercely. Every rose was chosen by her. Every path laid according to her direction. She grew lavender in long rows and trained, climbing white roses on the south wall, and grew herbs along the east beds that she used for everything from headaches to homemade soap. She had a particular gift for knowing what a plant needed before the plant made it obvious. She called it listening to the garden, and my father thought it was a charming affectation, and Caspian and I thought she was simply always right. She had died when Caspian was 17 and I was 12, and after she died no one went into the walled garden again. Not because anyone forbade it. No one said, "The garden is closed." It was more that the garden became, without discussion, a place that was simply not visited. The gate was unlocked. The stone walls stood. And inside, over 15 years, the roses went unchecked, and the lavender went woody, and the herb beds filled up with weeds. And the climbing roses on the south wall grew so densely across the old stone that by the time Emmeline arrived, the whole garden had become a tangle of beautiful wildness with no human management to it at all. She found it in her 3rd week at Veldermeer. She had been walking the estate. She walked the estate regularly, which was already unusual enough that the stable hands noticed, and she came around the south corner of the house and found the gate in the wall. The latch was an old iron one, slightly rusted. She lifted it because she was the sort of person who lifted latches on closed gates and went inside. She stood in the middle of that overgrown garden for perhaps 20 minutes just looking. The climbing roses had gone unpruned so long they'd formed a canopy over one end of the central path. The lavender was still there, straggled and half dead, but the roots were old and strong. The rose bushes along the inner walls were enormous, overgrown in the way of things that have been alive and left alone, vigorous in their own wild growth and entirely shapeless. And everywhere else, grass growing through the gravel, weeds through the beds, a trellis half fallen against the east wall, a stone bench with moss growing thick across its seat. She came in to dinner that evening and said to Caspian, "The walled garden on the south side." He looked up from his soup. "Do you object to it being tended?" she said. Something crossed his face that I cannot name even now, not precisely, something that was not quite pain and not quite guardedness, only the very particular stillness of a man who does not want to reveal that he feels anything. He said, "It is in disuse." "I noticed," she said. "Do you object?" He said, "You may do as you like with it." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and went back to her soup. She began the next morning. She came down before 7 o'clock in old clothes, a plain dark dress with the sleeves rolled up, a worn apron, a pair of leather gardening gloves too large for her hands that she'd found in the estate's tool room. She had asked Jenkins, the undergardener, to help her, and Jenkins, who was a practical man, had said he would need direction, and she had said she would provide it. I came to dinner that evening to find Emmeline at the table with a smear of garden soil along her forearm that she had missed in washing, explaining to no one in particular, to me, since Caspian was reading a letter, that the climbing rose on the south wall was in better condition than she'd feared. With careful pruning over 2 seasons, it could be trained properly. The lavender would need cutting back hard. The herb beds could probably be saved. She thought the central path gravel needed replacing entirely. Caspian put down his letter. He had not, technically, been reading it for the last 3 minutes. He said, "Which lavender?" "The rose along the east beds," she said. 8 or 9 plants. The root systems are established. I think they've simply been left too long without management." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My mother planted those." A silence. Emmeline looked at him. "I know," she said. "Morley told me." She paused. "I will not remove them." I said, "Cut back, not remove. The roots are intact. They will regrow." She met his eyes, steady and without apology or excessive gentleness. "They're worth saving." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his letter. "Do as you think best," he said, and his voice, just briefly, was not as controlled as usual. I looked at my soup. Over the following weeks, the garden became the place where I watched my brother begin in the most incremental possible way to unseal himself. He did not go into the garden himself, not at first, but I noticed that he had taken to working in his south-facing study in the early mornings, rather than the north-facing library where he usually read correspondence. From the south study, you could look down into the walled garden. From the south study, you could see Emmeline working. I did not mention this. I'm a tactful person, whatever Caspian thinks. He sent for a book on rose cultivation from the county town's bookshop. He left it on the hall table one evening without any indication it was for her. She picked it up, read the spine, and said without looking at him, "Thank you," in a tone that was equally without comment. He said, "It was merely lying about." She said, "Of course." The book went upstairs with her and did not come back. 2 weeks after that, Emmeline told him at dinner that she thought the south wall needed a new gate. The old hinges were too corroded to hold reliably, and she was concerned about the deer that had been coming through the estate's north meadow. She said she did not mind the deer themselves, but they had a tendency to eat roses. She said it quietly, as a practical matter. He said, "I'll have it seen to." The next morning he had the estate carpenter out to measure. The new gate went in 3 days later, oak framing with iron hinges, solid enough to last another century. Emmeline inspected it, ran her gloved hand along the frame, and said, "That will do very well." The carpenter reported this to Morley, and Morley reported it to me with an expression of considerable satisfaction. The accounts were more contentious. Caspian had managed Veldermere's accounts himself since taking the dukedom. He was not a careless man with money, quite the opposite. He was precise, organized, and had increased the estate's net holdings every year for 7 years. He was also, I would say with brotherly candor, not particularly interested in hearing suggestions about how he managed them. Emmeline had been reviewing the household accounts for a month when she came to him with what she called a discrepancy. She did not call it an error. She did not call it a problem. She said there was a discrepancy in the quarterly staff payments that suggested the linen and laundry costs were being recorded under two different headings in two different ledgers, which meant the actual figure could not be accurately reconciled without combining them, which had not been done, which made the quarterly summary something other than accurate. Caspian looked at the page she put before him. He did not look at her. He said, "These accounts have been maintained by the same system for 11 years. "Yes," she said, "I know. The discrepancy only becomes visible when you look at both ledgers simultaneously." She set the second ledger beside the first, open to the relevant pages. "Here," she said and pointed. A silence. He looked. He looked for a long time. Emmeline said nothing, simply stood beside the desk with her hands folded, waiting with the patience of a woman who has spent years waiting for people to come around to what she already knew. "I see it," he said at last. "I can restructure the recording system if you like," she said, not triumphant, not even particularly satisfied, only practical. "It would require reclassifying the existing entries for the last 2 years, but it would prevent the discrepancy from recurring." He looked up at her. It was a long look. She met it without flinching. He said, "Yes, do that." He paused and then said something that was, for Caspian Harrow, the equivalent of a declaration. The system needed reviewing. She said, "Most systems do eventually." She picked up the ledgers. "Thank you, Your Grace." And that was that. Except that afterward, Caspian told me this was 3 months in over a glass of his excellent port, which he poured for me with the particular generosity of a man who needs to tell someone something and is choosing his medium carefully, that the discrepancy had been there for 11 years and he had not noticed it. "She noticed it in 4 weeks, he said. He said it not with resentment, only a particular quality of assessment, like a man revising a map. "She is very capable," I said. "Yes," he said. A pause. "She is not what I expected," he said. I did not ask what he had expected. I had a reasonable idea, and I thought it would do neither of us good to examine it too closely. I said no, and drank my port, and my brother sat beside the fire in the drawing room of his shut-tight house and looked at the flames and did not say anything else about it for the rest of the evening. There was, in the weeks that followed, a small and particular exchange between them that I heard about from Emmeline, and that I have thought about many times since. She had taken to rising early. She was, by nature, an early-rising person, and Veldermere's mornings were her time to walk the estate before the day's work required her. One morning in the 2nd month she came down earlier than usual, at perhaps 6:30, and found the kitchen fire cold. The kitchen maid who usually had it going by that hour was ill in bed. Emmeline, without any ceremony, built the fire herself. She had been doing so for her own household since she was 15, and saw no reason to stand in a cold kitchen waiting for someone else to do it. The cook arrived 20 minutes later to find the kitchen fire burning, the kettle on, and the Duchess of Veldermere sitting at the kitchen table making notes in a small notebook. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Potts who had been in the position for 12 years and who had a complicated relationship with change, stood in the kitchen doorway and stared. Emmeline looked up and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Potts. I've left the breakfast arrangements to you. I only needed the fire going." Mrs. Potts said later to Morley, who told me, that she hadn't known quite what to say. She had been at Veldermere long enough to remember the late Duchess, who had been a warm and energetic woman. But she had not, in all those years and the 15 since, expected to find anyone at the kitchen table at 6:30 making notes. She made the Duchess a cup of tea. Emmeline thanked her, gathered her notes, and went upstairs to change for a walk. The incident became, as small things do in a household, more widely known than it might have been. Caspian heard about it from Morley as he heard about most things. He came to the evening meal that day and sat down and said, with the air of a man who has been thinking about something for several hours, "I understand the kitchen fire was cold this morning." "Yes," Emmeline said. "The kitchen maid is unwell. I dealt with it." He looked at her. "You built the fire yourself." "I have done so before," she said, without any apology or explanation in her tone, only the calm of a woman who does not feel that a practical act requires defending. "It is not difficult." He said nothing for a moment. He had, I think, been about to say something about the household staff and their proper duties, the sort of thing a man who has never needed to build a fire in his life says easily. He looked at her instead. He thought of the estate accounts, and the ledgers and the garden and the tenant cottage roof tiles, and he said nothing of the sort. He said, "I will have a second kitchen maid engaged." She said, "That is very considerate, thank you." She served herself from the dish in front of her. Caspian ate his dinner in a silence that I can only describe, having been told about it in detail, as contemplative rather than cold. In the second month, there was a dinner. Lady Hartwell, who owned the adjacent estate to the east and had been making social overtures to Veldermere for 3 years without success, called on Emmeline and issued an invitation. It was, I suspected, partly genuine welcome and partly the intense curiosity of a woman who wanted to see what the cold Duke had married and why. I was included, as I often was in social things, because Caspian found social things easier when there was someone present he was comfortable with, and I was the only person he was comfortable with. We went. Emmeline wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that was good quality and simply cut, and had been made perhaps 3 years previously. Not fashionable, not plain, only well-made and worn with the composure of a woman who does not require fashion to know she is presentable. Lady Hartwell greeted her with warm curiosity barely concealed behind courtesy. The drawing-room was full of local gentry, all of whom wanted to see what had happened, and all of whom were extremely interested in Emmeline. I watched my brother watch his wife work the room. She did not perform. She did not charm. She was simply good company. She listened carefully and asked genuine questions. She noticed when the vicar's wife looked uncomfortable and drew her into a conversation about parish schools that put her at ease. She argued briefly but firmly with Colonel Weston about the management of the river drainage on his property and was correct, and he knew it and laughed about it. She made Lady Hartwell feel that her opinion on the county hospital subscription was genuinely valued, because Emmeline genuinely valued it. Caspian stood beside me near the window for much of the first hour. He had a glass of wine he was not drinking, and he was watching Emmeline with the expression he had been refining for 3 months now, focused, private, reassessing. He said without looking at me, "She is talking to everyone." "Yes," I said. She doesn't seem to find it an effort." "No," I said, "I don't think she does." He looked at her across the room. She was laughing at something the vicar had said, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind people don't produce when they're performing. He said very quietly, "I find it an effort." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She doesn't require me to." I looked at him. He was still watching her, still very composed, but there was something in that sentence that was not composure, something that was, if you knew how to read my brother, close to relief. "No," I said, "she doesn't." He drank his wine. We drove home that night and Emmeline told me in the carriage that she thought the river drainage on the Weston property would cause problems for the North Road by winter, and that Colonel Weston was a sensible man who would address it if it was put to him correctly. Caspian said, from his corner of the carriage, "I'll write to him." She looked across at him. He was looking out the window. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said nothing, and in the dark of the carriage I could not see either of their faces, but the silence between them was, I thought, of a different quality than it had been 3 months before. Later that week, I came upon a conversation I was not meant to hear. I had arrived at Veldermere a quarter of an hour early. The road had been better than expected, and let myself in through the side door as I often did, and I could hear from the direction of the study Caspian speaking. The door was ajar. I was not trying to listen. I was simply there. He was reading aloud, not in the manner of a man performing, but in the manner of a man reading something to himself by speaking it, a habit he had had since boyhood. When anything complex, he read aloud to organize it. What he was reading aloud was, as far as I could make out, a section of the tenancy agreements relating to field drainage obligations. And then I heard Emmeline's voice from within the study. She was in the study then with him, saying, "The clause on the following page modifies it. If the culvert passes through 2 parcels of land, the maintenance responsibility is shared. Groves's field shares a boundary with the Veldermere North section." A pause, then Caspian said, "Yes, I see that." Another pause. I read this agreement many times. I did not see that clause before." She said mildly, "You were probably reading for different things." He said, "No doubt." I stood in the corridor for a moment listening to the complete and companionable quiet that followed, two people sitting together in a study reading the same document, one of them reading it aloud and the other following along. A thing that requires a degree of ease with each other's presence that is not manufactured and cannot be faked. I turned and went back to the side door and knocked this time before coming in. When I was shown into the study, they were both seated, Emmeline in the armchair to the side of the fireplace with a ledger open in her lap, Caspian at his desk with the tenancy agreement before him, and everything was perfectly ordinary except that there was a second tea cup on the tray on the desk that had not been there the last time I had sat in this room. And it was, I noticed, placed on Caspian's side of the desk rather than across from it, which is where you put a second cup for a guest, and not where you put one for someone who is simply there. I took the chair across from them both and asked for tea, and said nothing about any of it. But I thought about that second cup for the rest of the afternoon, and I thought, there it is. The thing about watching my brother fall in love, though I would not have called it that at the time, not quite, was that it was extraordinarily quiet. It did not announce itself. There was no single dramatic moment you could point to and say, there, that was when it happened. It was, he began to be in whatever room she was in. Not obviously, not in a manner anyone could call attention to. He was a man who moved through his own house with perfect freedom, and he continued to do so, and it simply became observable if you were watching that the drawing room where he sat with his correspondence in the evenings was the drawing room where she also tended to spend her evenings, where she sat with her mending or her reading, on the opposite side of the fireplace from him, not in conversation, not pressing herself into his awareness, simply there. And he was there. And neither of them appeared to find this remarkable. I felt it was remarkable. I came to dinner and observed the two of them sitting in their respective chairs on either side of the fireplace reading in comfortable silence, like people who have been doing this for 20 years, and I thought, this is extraordinary. I came to dinner one evening in the third month to find Emmeline had left a corrected estate account on Caspian's desk. She had gone through the summer quarters figures and made several amendments, which she'd marked in her clear, small hand. Caspian had returned it to her later that afternoon, I know because I arrived as it was being returned, with two of her corrections accepted without comment and a marginal note beside the third that read, "The Brentley parcel was reclassified in June, see attached correspondence." The note was in Caspian's handwriting, which was precise and angular, and beside it, in his same hand, was a small additional note that read only, "Your method for the linen reconciliation is cleaner than the old system." Well done. I saw this note because Emmeline showed it to me, briefly and without comment, the next time I came to dinner. She showed it the way she might show me a receipt for something she'd bought that had turned out to be useful, acknowledging it without sentiment. Then she put it back in the ledger. I did not say anything, but I thought about the fact that my brother had never in his life written "well done" in the margin of a document. He did not traffic in praise. He was not the sort of man who annotated. He corrected and he agreed and he returned things silently, and that was all. A "well done" in the margin of a household account was, in the language of Caspian Harrow, very close to a declaration. There was also the matter of the pianoforte. Veldermere Hall had a music room that no one had used in 15 years. The pianoforte in it was a fine instrument that my mother had played well, and which had been tuned regularly by habit. Caspian had kept up the tuning even after she died, on a kind of silent principle, though I had never heard him say why and had never asked. The instrument sat in the music room under a cloth. The candelabra on either side of it were polished and fitted with fresh candles. The room was dusted. No one played. Emmeline discovered the music room in her 4th week, on one of her systematic explorations of the house. She went through every room eventually, quietly and methodically, cataloging what was there and what condition it was in. Morley had offered to give her a tour, and she had thanked him and said she preferred to look herself. She was like that about things. She preferred to see with her own eyes. I do not know precisely when she began playing. I know that Morley noticed it first one evening at dusk, a sound coming from the music room. He described it to me as hesitant at first and then less so, as if someone were feeling their way back to something they had not done in some time. The playing was not showy. It was not the kind of performance you would have to hear. It was quieter than that, and more private, and Morley had not mentioned it to anyone in the household because he had the instinct, which years at Veldermere had given him, of knowing which things were not to be remarked upon. Caspian heard it one evening when he passed the music room door. He stopped. I know this because he told me later in the same port and fire session in which he told me about the account discrepancy, in the careful oblique way he told me things that had affected him. He said, "She plays in the evening sometimes." He said it the way he might report a feature of the landscape, a stream that had appeared, a tree he had not noticed before. He said, "She plays my mother's pieces." I said, "How do you know they are your mother's pieces?" He looked at the fire for a moment. He said, "I remember them." A pause. He said, "I had not heard them in 15 years. I did not say anything. Caspian refilled my glass. We sat with the fire for a while and said nothing more about it, and I think it was one of the more honest conversations I had ever had with my brother, in the way that certain conversations between people who know each other very well are honest precisely because almost nothing is said. Emmeline, when I asked her about it much later, said she had found a stack of music in the bench seat of the pianoforte. Old sheets, the pages soft with use. She had recognized some of the pieces and could not recognize others. She had played in the evenings because the music room was pleasant at dusk, and because she had always played in the evenings at home when the household work was done. She said she had not known, at first, that anyone could hear. I asked if she had minded once she knew. She said no. She paused, with that particular quality she had of pausing only when something was worth saying carefully. "He never asked me to stop. He never mentioned it at all." She looked at her tea. I thought that was rather kind of him." She was right. It was, for Caspian, quite remarkably kind. He could easily have said nothing to her at all and had merely mentioned that the music room was to be kept closed. He had not. He had walked past the door and stopped and listened, and the next evening she had played again, and he had not walked past again. She had not heard his step in the corridor. But the fact remained that the music room door was always left slightly open when she played, and the candles in the corridor outside were always lit. In the 4th month, I came to the drawing room one evening an hour later than I had intended. I had lost track of time over a letter, and when I arrived, the house was quiet and the drawing room door was slightly ajar, and I looked in before knocking and saw this. Emmeline was asleep in her chair. She had been reading, the book was open in her lap, one hand still on the page, and she had fallen asleep with her head against the chair back, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her face utterly still. The fire had burned low. The room was warm and dim and very quiet. Caspian was sitting in his chair opposite. He was not asleep. He was not reading. He was sitting with his book closed in his hands, looking at her, with an expression on his face that I can describe only as undefended, entirely without the careful composure he wore in every public moment of his life. He was simply looking at her, and his face was the face of a man who has, without meaning to, allowed himself to feel something entirely unwelcome and entirely real, and has not yet decided what to do about it. I went back into the hall. I sat down on the hall bench. I waited 15 minutes, and then I made enough noise coming back to the door that anyone inside would have time to reassemble themselves. When I knocked and entered, Emmeline was awake. She had woken at the first sound of my boots, and Caspian was reading his book with every appearance of having been reading it for some time. I sat down. We had a perfectly normal evening. No one said anything. But I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I was told, Caspian appeared in the drawing room at an hour when Emmeline was normally there reading the morning correspondence, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "You fell asleep in your chair last night." She looked up from her letters. "Yes," she said without embarrassment, "I was tired." He said, "You have been working very long days." She looked at him. He was not quite looking at her. He was looking at the room in the manner of a man who is saying something he has considered saying and is not certain how it is being received. She said, "I work at the pace the work requires." He said, "Yes," a pause, "nevertheless." He cleared his throat, which was the closest my brother came to fumbling. He said, "You need not wait to close up the house. I am perfectly able to." He stopped. He tried again. "You do not need to remain awake on my account." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I was not remaining awake on your account. I was reading." He said, "I see." She said, however, a pause of her own, "It is a very pleasant room in the evening." He said, "Yes, I have always thought so." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "I will have Mrs. Calloway bring in a second lamp for the reading." She said, "Thank you." He left. The second lamp appeared that afternoon, placed on the side table nearest her customary chair. Emmeline showed me the lamp briefly when I next came to dinner. She did not comment on it. I did not comment on it. But there it was, a lamp placed for her use in a room my brother also happened to spend his evenings in by a man who did not, as a rule, think about other people's lighting requirements. It was not a declaration, it was a lamp. But in a life constructed almost entirely of controlled distances and careful silences, a lamp placed just where it would be useful is sometimes everything. I have thought in the years since about what it means to change. People speak of it as if it is a dramatic thing, a moment, a revelation, a sudden turning. My brother did not change dramatically. He changed the way the garden changed, slowly from the roots in the cold months when nothing appeared to be happening at all. The lavender did not show its new growth until spring. Caspian did not show his until October. But the roots had been working all along in the dark, doing what roots do, reaching toward whatever it is they reach toward. Emmeline understood this. She was a gardener. She knew that you do not dig up a root to check on it. You tend the conditions and you wait, and you trust the thing that is alive to do its own work in its own time. In the 4th month, something happened in the garden. It was a late summer afternoon, soft and warm and gold-lit. I was in the drawing room after luncheon. Emmeline had excused herself to go down to the garden, which she did most afternoons. I was watching Caspian not read. He had been on the same page for 11 minutes, I counted. He said, "What exactly are you staring at, Edmund?" "Nothing," I said. "Are you planning to read that page or to memorize it?" He looked at his book. He turned the page. He was quiet for 3 minutes. Then he said, very casually, as if it were a minor observation, "I might walk out this afternoon." The South Pasture Fence report came back. "The South Pasture Fence," I said. The South section wanted reviewing. The South Pasture Fence ran along the far side of the walled garden. "Of course," I said with perfect neutrality. He went out. I sat in the drawing room and felt, for the first time, quite confident about how this was going to end. I do not know exactly what happened in the garden that afternoon. I have it from Jenkins, who was working near the east wall and saw most of it, and from Emmeline herself much later. He stood at the new oak gate for a moment before coming through. Emmeline was cutting back the second lavender row. She looked up when the gate opened, and when she saw it was Caspian, she simply looked at him and said, "Come to check the gate." He said, "I came to check the south fence." He stood just inside the gate. She went back to the lavender. After a moment she said, "Your mother planted the lavender as well as the roses. Did you know she brought the original cuttings from the property in the west where she grew up?" She was not looking at him. "Jenkins told me. He was here when she was." A pause. Caspian said, "Yes, I knew that." "She used the dried lavender for headaches," Emmeline said. "Did you know that?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember the smell of it." She looked up then. She looked at him directly, the way she always did, without performance, without softening it, and she said, "It will smell the same again next summer. The plants are healthier than they've been in years." He looked at the lavender. He looked at the garden, at the pruned, climbing roses on the south wall beginning to show their new shape, at the clear gravel path, at the trimmed borders, at the bench where the moss had been carefully removed from the stone. He stood in his mother's garden, which had not been entered in 15 years, and which his wife had been quietly bringing back to life for 3 months. He said, "You have done considerable work here." "It is not finished," she said. She went back to cutting. "It will need another season at least before it's properly shaped. But the bones are good." He stood in the garden for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not help. He did not hinder. He looked at the garden and occasionally at her, working efficiently and without apparent self-consciousness, and then he said, "I will not keep you," and went out through the gate. Jenkins reported later that the Duke had stood outside the gate for another 10 minutes before walking on. I heard about this from Morley, and I sat very quietly in my kitchen that evening and thought about my brother for a long time. In the 5th month, they had a significant argument. It concerned the matter of a tenant farmer named Groves on the estate's north side, whose lease was up for renewal. Caspian had decided not to renew it on the grounds that Groves had failed to maintain the drainage in the north lower field, which had allowed waterlogging that damaged the adjacent Veldermere crop. Emmeline had reviewed the correspondence. She had also, on her walks, walked the north lower field. She told Caspian at dinner that the drainage failure was a consequence of the culverts along the field boundary needing clearing, which was the estate's responsibility, not the tenants', and which had not been done in 3 years, and that Groves had in fact petitioned the estate in writing twice about it without receiving any response, and that not renewing his lease on those grounds would be unjust. Caspian said the culverts were the tenants' responsibility. She said they were not, and produced, from what I can only imagine was an increasingly comprehensive internal filing system she maintained in her head, the relevant section of the standard Veldermeer tenancy agreement, which she quoted from memory. He said she was misreading the clause. She said she was not. This went on for some time. I was not there. Morley heard it from the next room and described it to me with an expression of awed uncertainty, as though he had witnessed something unfamiliar in nature, which in a sense he had, because no one in Morley's memory had ever argued with the Duke of Veldermeer to his face and refused to yield. Emmeline did not yield. She also did not raise her voice. She simply, calmly, repeatedly presented the same argument in different formulations until Caspian had no remaining counterargument that held, and then she stopped and waited. The silence, Morley said, was very long. Then Caspian said, "I will have the culverts reviewed." "Thank you," Emmeline said, "and the Groves lease." Another silence. Then, "I will consider the renewal." The lease was renewed the following week. The culverts were cleared within the fortnight. Groves sent a letter of gratitude to the Duchess of Veldermeer, which was the first letter addressed to a Duchess of Veldermeer that Morley had received in 15 years, and which he brought to Emmeline on a silver tray with considerably more ceremony than was strictly required. She read it, said "good," and put it in her correspondence file. She did not say anything about it to Caspian. He heard about it from his land steward. He did not say anything to her about it either. But that evening, when I came to dinner, I sat down at the table and found 2 things that had not been at the dinner table before. A small spray of white roses from the garden in a glass of water at the center of the table, and Caspian, who was already seated, looking at the roses with an expression I could not entirely interpret, something between acknowledgement and the particular stillness of a man who is deciding whether to feel something. Emmeline came in, looked at the roses, and then looked at Caspian. He met her eyes briefly. She sat down. She said, "The south wall climbing roses came into the second flush this week. There are more than I expected." He said, "My mother brought them from a garden in France. She was very particular about roses." Emmeline said, "I know. I can see her choices all through the garden. She had excellent judgment." She said it quietly and precisely, not as flattery but as an honest assessment. She knew what to plant and where to put it. He looked at her across the roses between them. I drank my soup and said nothing, and thought that the shutters on my brother's house were beginning, very quietly, one at a time, to open. 6 months arrived on a Wednesday in October. I did not know the exact date. Emmeline knew it. I learned afterward that she had known it from the first week, had counted it in the back of her mind the way you count a thing you are not sure whether you want or dread. She had been through the terms of the covenant enough times that every clause was familiar to her. She had thought about what the 6-month review meant and had made no decision, because the only decision she had to make was not yet clear, and she had learned, long ago, not to make decisions before the facts were in front of her. And Caspian knew it, because Caspian knew every date in every covenant he had ever signed with a precision that was his particular characteristic. He came to find her in the morning. She was in the garden. The roses had gone over now. It was October, and she was cutting them back for winter, moving along the south wall with careful and practiced snips. The morning air was cold and still. The garden held the particular quiet of late autumn, the shapes of things declared against the pale sky, the bones of the beds showing through. The new gate swung open, and she heard his step on the gravel and turned. He stood in the garden in his coat and said, "Miss Farrow." She had been Mrs. Harrow legally for 6 months, but he still called her Miss Farrow sometimes, in the way of a man who had not quite decided how to recalibrate. She looked at him. His face was composed. He held, she told me later, a folded document in his hand. "This is the 6-month date," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have prepared the dissolution documents," he said. "All the settlements remain exactly as agreed. Your father's debts remain cleared. Your siblings' trust is intact. There is a further settlement I have included for 6 months of service, which I intend to be generous." He held the document out. "Everything is arranged. You are free to go whenever you like." She looked at him. She looked at the document. She took it from his hand and looked at it for a moment, at the clean, formal lines of his solicitor's writing, the careful paragraphs, the arrangements he had made with his usual precision and thoroughness. Everything provided for, everything ordered. She thought he arranged this himself. Not his solicitors. They had been involved in the original covenant, but this document had the quality of something personally directed. He had thought about what she would need. He had been careful about it. She thought he expected me to go. She looked up at him. He was standing very still, watching her read. His face, with that perfect composure that she had learned over 6 months, was not quite the same as no feeling at all. She had come to know the particular quality of his stillness when he was feeling something he had decided not to show. She knew it the way you know any familiar landscape, the way you know where the paths are even in the dark. In the space of that moment, she thought quite clearly about the last 6 months. She thought about the new gate on the garden that had gone up in 3 days, unasked. She thought about the lamp placed beside her chair. She thought about a book on rose cultivation left on a hall table without explanation, and a second kitchen maid engaged the week after a cold fire, and a margin note in the handwriting she had come to know as well as her own, "Well done," in that precise angular hand. She thought about a man who had stood outside a garden gate for 10 minutes after she had gone back to work, not yet able to come in and not yet able to leave. She thought about the music room door left slightly open in the evenings, and the corridor candles always lit, and a second teacup on a study tray placed not across the desk but beside it. She thought about a winter evening, and a drawing-room fireplace, and the look on his face when he had not known anyone was watching. She thought he has been, in his quiet way, asking this question for months. In every arrangement made without prompting, in every adjustment conceded, and every correction accepted, and every evening spent in the same room for no stated reason, he has been asking. He simply did not know how to put it in words. And now he has put it in the wrong words entirely. These careful formal papers, this legal exit arranged with his usual precision. Because he is a man who knows how to arrange for every contingency and does not yet know how to simply ask whether someone wants to stay. She understood that. She had understood him, she thought, for several months now, had seen the pattern of him the way you learn to read an estate, by walking it many times in different weathers until you know where the soft ground is and where the stone runs solid underneath. She said, "Why did you prepare them?" "It is the 6-month provision," he said. I know what the provision says," she said. "I'm asking why you prepared them." She looked at him steadily. "You prepared them. You did not simply inform me the date had come. You prepared the documents and included a further settlement and came to give them to me yourself. Why?" Caspian was quiet. He was a man who had spent so long answering the official versions of questions that he had become extremely proficient at it, and Emmeline had just, with her particular calm directness, declined to offer him the official version. He stood in the garden in October, holding dissolution papers, and had nothing to retreat to. He said at last, "Because I did not think you could wish to stay." She said, "You did not think, or you were afraid to think." The silence was a long one. She took the papers from his hand. She looked at them. Then she folded them in half and tucked them without ceremony into the pocket of her gardening apron. She looked back at the south wall. "The roses will need to be tied back before the first frost," she said. "I have not done the east corner yet." She picked up her shears. "And the lavender needs to be mulched." He said carefully, "Emmeline." She turned. He had called her by her name, not Miss Farrow, not the formal mode. And she turned because it was the first time he had done it, and they both knew it. He was looking at her with an expression that I, who know his face better than almost anyone, could identify as the expression of a man who has reached the limit of his own composure, and has decided, not without considerable difficulty, to proceed past it. He said, "I do not want to dissolve the covenant." She waited. He said, "I want," and then stopped, because Caspian had spent his entire adult life not saying "I want" to anyone, and the sentence was in territory he had no map for. He looked at the garden, he looked at her. He said, "This garden is you've," he stopped again. She said gently, "Yes." "I have not been in this garden since my mother died," he said. "I told myself it was because it needed no attention. I told myself," he paused. "I was wrong about that. It needed a great deal of attention. I simply did not, I could not." "I know," she said. She said it very quietly. He looked at her. He said, "I was wrong about a number of things." She held his gaze, not rushing him, not softening the moment with false reassurance. Simply, "Here." He said, "I am asking you, not requiring you, not as a covenant. I am asking you whether you would choose to stay." He paused. "Here, with me." Another pause, as if the words were unfamiliar on their way out. "As my wife, actually, not," he made a short, controlled gesture that encompassed the folded document in her apron pocket and everything it had represented. "Not as an arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. The garden was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the south pasture, a wood pigeon called. The climbing roses against the wall held their winter shape, bare canes, carefully cut back, tied against the warm stone, waiting. She said, "I told you this garden was not finished." "Yes," he said. "I intend to see it finished," she said. "That is going to take at least another season, possibly two." She looked at him. "I am not inclined to leave a thing I have begun unfinished." He said, "No. I have noticed that about you." She said, "I have noticed a number of things about you as well." A pause. He said, "Will you tell me what they are?" She stepped toward him one step on the gravel of the path she had cleared, and she looked up at him and said, "In time." She held out her hand, not a curtsy, not a formal gesture. Simply, her hand offered. "Ask me properly first." He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And then Caspian Harrow, the cold Duke of Veldermere, who had managed 7 years of a dukedom without once being undone by anything, took a breath and said, without any armor at all, "Will you stay? Not for the covenant, not for the arrangement. Will you stay because you want to, because I—" He stopped. He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression of a man who has put down every defense he owns and is simply standing there. "Because I cannot imagine this garden without you in it now, and I cannot imagine this house." She took his hand. She held it in both of hers, which were still slightly cold from the morning air and still gloved, and she said, "Yes." He said, "That's, I should say." "You don't need to say anything," she said. "Not yet." They stood in the garden for a time. The October light was thin and clear. The garden was stripped for winter and sleeping and more alive in its dormant way than it had been in 15 years. I heard all of this later from Emmeline, over tea at my kitchen table. In the cheerful and unsentimental way she told stories. She gave me the essential shape of it with the composure of a woman reporting something that had been, from her perspective, not entirely surprising. She said, "I had rather thought he was going to find his way to the question eventually." She said this with the faint, controlled satisfaction of a woman who had been patient and had been correct, which are the two things she most valued in herself. I said, "You might have helped him along." She said, "He needed to get there himself. You know what he's like." I did know. I knew precisely what he was like, and I knew that the person who knew him best now was not his solicitors, not Morley, not his land steward, and not his younger brother. It was the woman sitting at my kitchen table who had arrived at Veldermere with a trunk, a case of ledgers, and no particular expectation of being anything other than practical, and had in 6 months tended a neglected garden, reformed the household accounts, fought for a tenant farmer's lease, and dismantled, with infinite patience and complete composure, every wall my brother had spent 15 years building. At Christmas that year, the whole family gathered at Veldermere for the first time since our mother died. There were cousins and aunts, and the old family friends who had not come, because there had never been, before, a reason to. The house was lit, all of it. Emmeline had gone through every room in the weeks before and had not permitted so much as a damp-smelling corridor to survive the preparation. And the fires were all burning, and the dining room was warm, and there was, in the entrance hall, a kissing bough of winter greenery that Emmeline had made with her own hands from the garden, from rosemary and holly and ivy, and the last of the dried lavender. Caspian looked at the kissing bough when he came down the stairs on Christmas morning. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Emmeline, who was standing in the hall directing the arrangement of the dinner table through the open dining room door and paying no attention to him. Then he walked past her, stopped, and kissed her on the top of her head, once brief, entirely without ceremony, and walked on into the drawing room. She stood where she was for a moment. She did not turn. Her shoulders, very slightly, altered, the way a person breathes differently when something has moved them and they are not yet ready to show it. Then she went back to directing the table arrangement. I watched this from the landing. I thought, good. and then I thought Mother would have liked her very much. That is the story as I know it. What came after, the years of it, the children, the seasons in the garden and the drawing room and the long evenings over ledgers and correspondence. The way Caspian learned, gradually, to speak rather than to be silent, and the way Emmeline never stopped being practical, never stopped being straightforward, never stopped saying the things she meant and meaning the things she said, all of that I was also present for, but it does not belong in this telling. This telling is only about the beginning. When I am asked, and I am asked, because this story has a way of becoming known in the kind of circles where people want to understand how these things happen, I say that the simplest answer is this. My brother needed someone who would not be afraid of him, and Emmeline Farrow was not afraid of anything. She had survived a father who gambled away everything she built, and she had packed her ledgers and gone without complaint to a house where no one expected her to be anything except decorative, and she had quietly, without announcement, made it into a home. She did not do it to change him. She did not arrive at Veldermere with a plan to unlock the cold Duke. She arrived with a genuine interest in the household accounts and a gardening instinct, and the kind of competence that is not ambitious, because it does not need to be, it simply is. And in being exactly what she was, fully and without apology, she became the only person who had ever actually seen my brother. Not his title, not his reputation, not the composed and shuttered man he showed the world, but the 17-year-old who had lost his mother and never opened her garden again. She saw that, she tended it, as she had tended the garden, with patience, with skilled hands, with the conviction that the roots were good and the thing was worth saving. It was. He called her Emmeline always, from that October morning forward. She called him Caspian, not your grace, not my lord, only his name, and it was startling, every time, the way his name sounded different when she said it, as though it had always been hers to say and had only been waiting. She kept the dissolution document folded in her apron pocket until the following spring. She showed it to me once, briefly. She had kept it in the drawer of her writing desk. I asked her why she had kept it. She said, because it was the moment he stopped pretending it was only an arrangement. She folded it back up. I thought it was worth keeping. She put it back in the drawer and closed it. The garden came into its second spring that April, with the climbing roses on the south wall reaching their proper shape at last, trained, pruned. The canes wired evenly along the warm stone, and the lavender rose thick and gray-green with new growth coming, and the herb beds cleared and planted, and the central path laid with fresh gravel, and the bench stone-clean in the April light. Caspian went into the garden that first warm April morning, not to review anything, not to check anything, only because it was the sort of morning where the south garden called you without speaking. Emmeline was already there, kneeling by the lavender with her gloves on and her sleeves rolled up, precisely as she had been in the first week of summer when he had stood in the gate and not come in. He came in this time. He came in and he sat down on the bench and he watched her work. After a while he picked up the second pair of gloves she had left on the end of the bench. She always left a second pair. He had noticed always, and he put them on, and he knelt beside her in the lavender, and he began, carefully and a little inexpertly, to do what she was doing. She looked at him. She did not say, "You don't need to do that." She did not say, "Let me show you." She simply adjusted her angle slightly to give him room and went on working, and after a moment he found the rhythm of it, and they worked side by side in the lavender in the April morning in the garden his mother had planted and Emmeline had brought back from the dead. This is what I know. This is the whole of it. A cold man in a cold house, and a woman who was not afraid of either, and a garden that needed tending, and the very simple, very difficult fact that love is not, in the end, a grand gesture or a sweeping declaration or a moment at a ball. It is a pair of gloves left on the end of a bench. It is a new gate built without being asked. It is a well done in the margin of a household account. It is a door opened, finally after 15 years, and someone standing in the frame saying, "The work is not finished. Neither am I." My brother was the most feared man in the northern counties for 27 years. I cannot speak to what anyone else thought of him. I only know what I saw. A man who, for the first time in his life, in an October garden, with a folded dissolution document in his wife's apron pocket and his mother's lavender at their feet, stopped being afraid. And Emmeline, who had come with a trunk and a case of ledgers and no expectation of being remarkable, who had tended a neglected garden and reformed a fractured household and loved, without drama or announcement, a man who did not yet know he needed it. She went home to Veldermere Hall and made it worthy of the name. She made it a place where the fires were warm and the accounts were clean and the garden bloomed, and where the most feared man in the northern counties came in from the cold every evening and was, in the company of the one person who had never been afraid of him, simply himself. That was everything. That was all of it. That was more than enough.